4 tons of coal an hour. That's what it took to feed the belly of a modern steam donkey. One machine, 4 tons, 1 hour. The beast would sit there on iron tracks, cables spinning, yanking stumps from the earth like a dentist pulling teeth. Efficient, mechanical, safe. But before that, before the machines came to claw stumps from the earth, 6 men, 12 oxen, 1 full day, 1 acre, and sometimes somebody didn't come home. The forest was the enemy, not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. Trees 11 feet thick, rising 70 feet into the sky, without a single branch. Roots thicker than a man's torso, gripping soil that settlers needed for corn. 65 million acres of it, standing between starvation and survival. The forest blocked sunlight. It held the ground. It killed men who tried to take it down. This is the story of how they fought it anyway, with axes forged in frontier blacksmith shops, with fire that sometimes spread farther than intended, with oxen dragging chains through mud until their shoulders bled, with dynamite that sometimes went off too soon or too late, or when a man was standing too close. It's the story of the most dangerous job in America, and it wasn't called a job. It was called clearing your land, because if you didn't, you starved. Your children starved. Your claim went to someone else, and every tree you'd already dropped, every stump you'd already burned, every drop of blood you'd put into that soil, it all went with it. Before we're done, you'll understand why an entire forest could explode in minutes, turning 500 square miles into an inferno. Why a man would plant dynamite under a stump while his family ate breakfast 50 yards away. Why communities would gather 30 yoke of oxen, 60 animals, hundreds of men, entire townships, just to clear 30 acres in a single day. We're going to find out how settlers turned a continent of trees into farmland and what it cost them, not in dollars, in bodies. When the forest was the enemy. In 1807, an Irish author named Isaac Weld traveled through the American frontier and wrote something that captured the settler mindset perfectly. He said Americans had an unconquerable aversion to trees. Read that again. Unconquerable aversion, not respect, not admiration. Aversion! That wasn't poetry. That was survival economics written in blood and sawdust. The forest wasn't a resource to these people. It was an obstacle, a wall, a living, breathing thing that stood between them and food. It blocked the sun their crops needed. It held the soil with roots that went down 20 feet. It harbored wolves and bears that killed livestock. Every tree standing was a bushel of wheat you couldn't grow. Every acre of timber was another year your family went hungry. So they declared war on it. The trees waiting for them were nothing like the second-growth forests we see today. Drive through New England or the Midwest now, and you'll see trees maybe 50, 60 feet tall, nice, pleasant, manageable. These were not those trees. These were virgin giants, oaks and elms and pines that had been growing since before Columbus set foot on this continent. Trees that measured 11 feet across at the base, not around, across. Trunks that rose 60, 70, sometimes 80 feet before the first branch. Stand next to one, and you'd barely come up to the first ring of bark. Look up, and all you'd see was trunk disappearing into a canopy so thick that noon felt like dusk on the forest floor. Colonel Strickland, an early settler, wrote about measuring a tree 11 feet in diameter. He described the trunk as rising like a majestic column, towering upwards for 60 or 70 feet before branching off its mighty head. Majestic, sure. Also terrifying if you needed that land for corn. By 1830, settlers in places like Williamstown, Massachusetts, had cleared over 70% of the forested land. Think about that timeline. The town was settled in the 1750s. It took 80 years to clear 70%. Not all of it, 70%. Between 1630 and 1880. 250 years, 65 million acres of southern forest came down. That's roughly the size of the entire state of Oregon. Gone, turned into fields. The eastern seaboard went from solid forest to patchwork farmland. But here's what the history books don't tell you. It took a lifetime to do it. An efficient man, working alone, could clear 1 acre in a week. That's 1 acre. 7 days of swinging an axe from dawn to dusk, and that's just the cutting. That doesn't include hauling the timber, burning the slash, or, and this is the part that broke men's backs and spirits, removing the stumps. The stumps, because a tree might fall in an afternoon. But that stump could outlive you. A family working together, doing nothing but clearing, could manage 5 acres in a year on top of their regular crops. 5 acres, and if you specialized in land clearing. If that's all you did, if you hired yourself out to other settlers and spent every daylight hour with an axe in your hands, you might clear 200 acres in a lifetime. 200 acres, an entire life's work. 40, 50 years of labor. That's the scale of the fight. The forest was the antagonist in this story. It had been there for thousands of years. It had roots that went down 20 feet, spreading out in every direction like fingers clutching the earth. It had weight measured in tons, and it had one advantage the settlers didn't: time. The forest could wait. It had waited through ice ages and droughts and storms. It could wait for a settler to give up, to fail, to die trying. The settlers had axes, but could those axes actually win? The axe, the fire, and the long wait. The weapon of choice was deceptively simple: a double-bit axe, steel head, wooden handle, weighed maybe 6 pounds. You could hold it in one hand if you wanted, though you'd never swing it that way. Every settler had one. Most had several, because an axe wasn't just a tool. It was survival. It was currency. It was identity. Men took pride in their axes the way gunslingers took pride in their revolvers. They'd say, "That fellow Anderson, he's got a wonderful axe." And everyone knew exactly what that meant. Sharp enough to shave with. Balanced so perfectly, you could close your eyes and hit the same spot twice. Tempered just right. Hard enough to hold an edge. Soft enough not to shatter on impact. You couldn't buy an axe like that at a store. There were no stores. You went to the blacksmith. The blacksmith would heat iron in his forge until it glowed orange. Then he'd hammer it, fold it, hammer it again. The steel for the cutting edge got worked separately, harder, sharper. He'd weld the pieces together, grinding the edge until it could split a hair. Then came the handle. Hickory, usually. Straight grain, no knots. Fitted to your grip, your height, your swing. That axe would outlast you if you treated it right. And you needed it to, because you were about to swing it 10,000 times a day. Felling a tree wasn't like chopping firewood. These weren't saplings. These were titans. You'd start by making a notch on one side, the direction you wanted it to fall. That notch had to be precise. Too shallow, and the tree might not fall. Too deep, and it could split, sending half the trunk straight back at you. Then you'd move to the other side and chop toward that notch until the tree's own weight did the rest. You'd hear it first, a crack like a rifle shot, then a groan. Then, if you'd done it right, the whole massive thing would lean slowly at first, then faster, faster, until it came down with a sound like thunder. When it fell, the ground shook, literally shook. You could feel it through your boots 100 yards away. But here's the problem. Cutting down a tree was just the beginning. Now, you had to deal with it, and dealing with it meant one of two approaches. You could cut it up, haul it away, and use the timber for building or fuel. Good timber, oak, walnut, cherry, went into cabins, barns, fences. A settler could build an entire homestead from 20 good trees, or you could let it rot where it fell and burn it later. Most settlers did both. They'd take the best timber for construction. The rest, stack it in piles 8 feet high and set it on fire. The logs would burn for days. You'd keep adding to the pile as you felled more trees. Eventually, you'd have a burn pile the size of a house, smoking and smoldering for weeks. And this is where things got interesting, because burning timber wasn't just disposal, it was revenue. Hardwood trees, oak, beech, maple, elm, produced something valuable when they burned: potash. Potash was the first cash crop of the American frontier. It was America's first industrial chemical, and it all came from wood ash. Here's how it worked. You'd collect the ashes after a burn. Good hardwood ash was gray-white, fine as powder. You'd build a wooden hopper, shaped like a V, and fill it with ash. Then you'd pour water through it. The water would leach out the potassium salts, dripping into collection pots as a dark brown liquid called lye. That lye went into massive iron kettles, potash kettles, which is where the name came from, and you'd boil it for hours. As the water evaporated, you'd be left with a crusty residue at the bottom. Black salts, that was potash. Europe wanted it desperately. They needed it for soap, glass, gunpowder, ceramics, and dyeing fabric. And American hardwoods produced better potash than European wood. Higher yield, better quality. 10 acres of good hardwood could yield 5 barrels of potash. Each barrel held 500 pounds. A single barrel sold in Montreal for $30. In 1790, New York, you could sell raw ashes for $3 to $6 per acre, about the same as it cost to hire someone to clear that acre in the first place. Do the math. 10 acres yielded 5 barrels at $30 each. That's $150. In 1790, author Joseph Pickering wrote in 1831 that when potash prices were high, the sale of ashes from land covered in timber would pay for the clearing of that land. You could literally burn the forest and get paid for it. Suddenly, burning the forest wasn't just clearing land, it was making money. It was turning an obstacle into profit. But there was a catch. Actually, several catches. First, the labor. Hardwood generated ashes at a rate of 60 to 100 bushels per acre, but it took 30 cords of wood to make a single ton of ashes. A cord is a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet deep, and 8 feet long. 30 of those stacks, and a ton of ashes only yielded about 300 pounds of potash. The math was brutal. The labor was worse. Second, you had to collect the ashes before rain turned them into worthless mud. Settlers built small log houses, ash houses, just to store dry ash. They'd shovel it, barrel it, haul it to the nearest potashery. The potashery would refine it further, heating it in a furnace to drive off impurities, turning black salts into pearl ash, lighter colored, higher quality, worth even more. It was back-breaking work, but it was the only way to turn a worthless pile of burned timber into something you could spend. Third, and this is the part that haunted them, the stumps didn't burn. You could light a massive pile of timber and watch it roar into the sky. The heat would melt snow 50 feet away. The flames would reach 30 feet high. You could reduce 100-year-old oaks to ash and steam, but the stumps sat there, charred, massive, immovable, mocking you. Some settlers tried a different method entirely: girdling. Girdling was adopted from Native Americans. You take an axe and cut a ring around the tree, removing all the bark in a band about 6 inches wide, all the way around the circumference. That cut severed the tree's nutrient flow. The phloem and cambium layers died. No food could reach the branches. The tree would die standing. Why bother? Because a dead tree didn't need to be hauled away immediately. You could girdle an entire acre in a week. Then plant corn right there between the dead trunks. The trees would drop their leaves. Sunlight would reach the ground. And in a few years, the wood would rot enough that you could push the tree over with a team of oxen or burn it where it stood. Girdling was efficient. It saved time. It let you plant crops years earlier than if you'd waited to clear everything first. But it created ghost forests, fields full of massive white specters, dead trunks standing like tombstones, charred bark peeling away in strips, bare branches reaching into the sky like skeletal fingers. Author Anna Jameson visited Upper Canada in 1838 and wrote about these ghost forests. It was a ghastly forest of tall white specters, strangely contrasting with the glowing, luxurious foliage all around. She described watching settlers work. "I never witness nor hear that first stroke of the axe without a shudder, and as yet I cannot look on with indifference. When these huge oaks, these umbrageous elms and stately pines are lying prostrate, lopped of all their honors, and piled in heaps with the brushwood to be fired." But the settlers didn't have time for sentiment. They had families to feed. Still, the stumps remained. And those stumps were the real enemy. Beech and maple stumps could be removed after 7 years of rot. The wood would soften, the roots would weaken. You could dig around them, chop through the main roots, and yank them out with oxen. Pine, elm, basswood, hemlock, 15 years, 15. Philemon Wright, founder of Hull, Quebec, wrote in 1823, "Beech and rock maple stumps are much more readily taken out after the 7th year. Pine, elm, basswood, and hemlock are less liable to rot, and therefore require about 15 years before they can be taken out, especially those of large size." 15 years? By the time a pine stump rotted enough to yank out, your kids were grown. Your first crops were long harvested. You'd lived with that stump sitting in the middle of your field for a decade and a half. So settlers did what desperate people do. They improvised, they got creative, they gathered the neighbors, and they invented machines that could multiply the strength of men and animals into something that could challenge the forest's grip on the earth. But could those machines actually work? Or would the forest win? 30 yoke of oxen. No man could remove a stump alone. Not the big ones. Not the ones with roots as thick as your leg running 20 feet in every direction, spreading out like an underground spider web. So they gathered. It was called a logging bee, or a stumping bee. The word bee came from the idea of working together like bees in a hive. Every community had them. They were part work, part social event, part survival mechanism. Here's how it worked. A family would send word to every settler within a 15 or 20-mile radius, sometimes farther. Bring your oxen, bring your chains, bring your handspikes and your muscle. We're clearing land. Date set, location known, no RSVP needed. And they'd come, not out of charity, out of necessity, because next month it would be your turn to host the bee, and you'd need those same neighbors to show up with the same tools and the same animals. It was reciprocal obligation made manifest. You helped them, they helped you. Everyone survived. 6 men working together could chop and burn an acre in a single day. But when it came to stumps, you needed more than men. You needed animals. Oxen were the workhorses of the frontier, literally. They were stronger than horses, steadier, less likely to panic when a stump suddenly broke free and came roaring out of the ground, spraying dirt and rocks in every direction. A good team of oxen could pull a ton. 2 teams, 2 tons, but the stumps weighed more than that, and they were anchored by roots. So you needed leverage, you needed mechanical advantage, you needed numbers. At one logging bee in the 1880s, Richard Hewitt's farm, where D. Sorby would later live, they had 30 yoke of oxen, 60 animals, 60 tons of pulling power, 4 men and a driver for every yoke. That's 150 men, plus the families watching, plus the cooks preparing food. The entire township showed up. They cleared 30 acres in a single day. 30 acres, think about that. 30 acres of stumps, roots, and rocks torn out of the ground in 8 hours. They'd stake out the field in advance, mark every stump, plan the order. Then, at dawn, they'd start, chains wrapped around stumps. Oxen hitched in series, 2 yoke, 3 yoke, sometimes 4, all pulling together. The men would position themselves around the stump with hand spikes, long iron bars for leverage, everyone moving in coordination. The boss would shout commands, the drivers would urge the oxen forward, the ground would groan, the chains would go taut. The oxen would lean into the harness, hooves digging into the dirt, and then, crack, a root the size of a man's thigh would snap like a gunshot. Then another. The stump would shift, tilt, and suddenly it would lurch free in an explosion of dirt and rocks and splintered roots. The men would cheer. The oxen would be led to the next stump. The chains would be reset, and the whole process would start again. By mid-afternoon, they'd have piles of stumps scattered across the field. Later, they'd drag them to the edges and burn them. But for now, the focus was extraction. When night came, they'd dance on the grass. Whiskey flowed. There was food, massive quantities of food. Venison, pork, bread, potatoes, whatever the hosting family could provide, and whatever neighbors brought. There was music. Irish pipes, Scottish pipes, fiddles if you were lucky. Sometimes dancing went until dawn. It wasn't just work. It was community survival wrapped in celebration. It was proof that together they could move mountains, or at least stumps the size of mountains. James Laird, who attended many logging bees, later recalled, "One logging bee, I was at Richard Hewitt's farm, and there were about 30 yoke of oxen there at this bee, and we had it all staked out, and we logged about 30 acres that day, and when night came, we had a dance on the green grass." But even with all that help, stumps were stubborn. Some could be chopped out with an axe, if you were willing to spend a full day digging around the roots. You'd dig a trench around the stump, exposing the main roots. Then you'd chop through them one by one with a grub axe, a smaller, heavier axe designed for root work. When enough roots were severed, oxen could pull the stump free. Others needed different approaches. The chains would be fastened around the biggest root you could find, and the team would pull. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the chain snapped and whipped back like a steel snake, capable of breaking bones or worse. Sometimes the root held, and the ox stumbled, going down hard. Stumping was dangerous work, and sometimes the stump puller arrived. The stump puller was one of the first real machines of land clearing, not powered, not self-propelled, but a machine nonetheless, a device that multiplied force through leverage and mechanical advantage. It showed up in the 1890s, patented by men with names like Packer, Kenwood, and Hercules. The design was ingenious, a massive tripod made of logs, anchored to existing stumps or trees, a cable drum mounted in the center, a chain or cable attached to the target stump, and a team of horses or oxen walking in circles, turning a vertical screw or capstan that slowly, agonizingly slowly, winched the stump out of the ground. The Hercules model was the king of stump pullers. It used a 3-to-1 pulley system. The cable ran through multiple pulleys, so it moved 1/3 as fast, but the pulling force tripled. 2 horses walking in circles could generate the pulling power of 6 horses pulling directly. With that kind of leverage, the Hercules could clear 5 acres of 1,261 stumps in 9 days. 3 men, 2 horses, 9 days. The University of Minnesota tested it around 1915 and documented the results. They worked 8-hour days. That's about 140 stumps per day. Compare that to doing it by hand. Months, maybe years. The machine worked, but it was slow, methodical, safe, relatively speaking. And some settlers didn't have months. They had crop seasons. They had mortgages. They had land that needed clearing now, not next year. So they turned to something faster, something more powerful, something that could blow a 500-pound stump clean out of the ground in 3 seconds flat. They turned to dynamite. But dynamite didn't just remove stumps. Sometimes it removed the man holding the fuse. The day the powder didn't wait, dynamite arrived on American farms in the late 1800s. Alfred Nobel invented it in 1867, a way to stabilize nitroglycerin and make it safe to handle. Safe being a very relative term. He called it dynamite, and it changed everything. By the early 1900s, every feed store sold it. You could buy dynamite the same way you bought nails, a few sticks, a box of blasting caps, a roll of fuse, no license, no background check, no questions, just cash. The formula for stumps was simple: 1/2 to 1 stick of dynamite for every inch of stump diameter. A 30-inch stump? 15 to 30 sticks. Each stick was about 8 inches long and 1 inch in diameter. You'd bore a hole under the center of the stump using an auger, a hand-cranked drill with a 5-foot shank. Bore down at an angle, getting the hole as close to the center of the stump as possible. Pack the dynamite as close to the wood as you could. The closer the explosive to the stump, the better the break. Insert the blasting cap into one stick, carefully, because the cap was sensitive. Attach the fuse to the cap. Lower the dynamite into the hole. Fill the hole with dirt and tamp it down gently. Not too hard. You could set off the cap, light the fuse, run. The fuse burned at 1 foot per minute. A 2-foot fuse gave you 2 minutes to get at least 20 rods away. That's about 300 feet, far enough that flying wood wouldn't kill you, usually. When it worked, dynamite was spectacular. You'd light the fuse and run. Get behind a tree or over a hill. Count the seconds, and then, boom! The charge would detonate under the stump, and the entire thing, 500 pounds of wood and root, would lift into the air. 4, 5, sometimes 6 feet straight up. The stump would shatter midair, breaking into pieces small enough to handle. The roots would tear free. Dirt would spray in every direction. And then it would rain wood, chunks of stump falling across the field. You could gather the fragments, pile them up, and burn them as firewood. It was fast. It was efficient. It was effective. It was also wildly dangerous. An East Side farmer near Kalispell, Montana, planted a charge under a stump near an old steel bridge. He lit the fuse, ran back, waited. Nothing happened. The fuse should have burned through by now. He waited longer. Still nothing. So he did what you should never, ever do. He walked back and leaned over the hole to see what was wrong. The charge detonated. The blast threw him backwards. He survived, barely. Lost both eyebrows, the sight in one eye, and most of his coveralls. The newspaper covering the incident concluded he was fortunate to have lost only that much. Fortunate, right. He needed to thaw it. Logical, reasonable, standard procedure. So he laid a dozen sticks on the open oven door of his wood-burning kitchen stove and went to the barn to start his morning chores. A few minutes later, the house disappeared in a substantial explosion. Gone! Frozen dynamite wasn't the only problem. Sometimes the fuse burned too fast. Moisture in the fuse core made it inconsistent. Sometimes it burned too slow and you'd think it was a dud and go back to check. Sometimes moisture got into the blasting cap and it wouldn't fire. Sometimes a stump didn't blow cleanly and you'd try to reuse the hole. Bad idea. Residual explosive could be unstable. Sometimes you'd pack too little and the stump wouldn't budge. Pack too much and you'd launch it 300 feet into your neighbor's field. And then there were the commercial explosives that came after World War I. It was also less stable, and settlers used it everywhere, not just for stumps, for everything. The pace of land clearing accelerated dramatically in the 1920s because of cheap surplus explosives. But those explosives came with a cost, and sometimes the cost was catastrophic. In 1894, something went wrong in Minnesota. Terribly wrong. Sparks from burning stumps ignited a pile of lumber at the Brennan Lumber Company. The pile held 28 million board feet of timber. 28 million. That's enough lumber to build thousands of houses. It caught fire. The fire spread. Fast. Too fast to stop. It jumped from the lumber pile to nearby brush. From brush to slash piles. The woody debris left over from logging operations. From slash piles to stump piles. From stump piles to standing timber. The forest floor was covered in fuel. 350,000 acres of it. Logging operations had left branches, bark, sawdust, and stumps scattered everywhere. Every acre was a bomb waiting for a spark. The wind picked up. The fire became a firestorm. It generated its own weather, tornado-like winds that sucked in air and pushed flames forward at 30 miles per hour. They called it the Hinckley Forest Fire. It burned 350,000 acres. That's 500 square miles. An area larger than the city of Los Angeles, completely burned, and it killed 418 people. 418. Men, women, children, entire families. Some died in their homes, some died trying to flee, some died in lakes and rivers, where they'd gone to escape the flames, only to be cooked alive when the water heated up or suffocated by the smoke that hung over the water. The town of Hinckley, Minnesota, was wiped off the map, and it started because someone didn't properly extinguish a stump fire. The Baudette Spooner fire took 42. The Chisholm fire burned 20,000 acres. These weren't wildfires in some distant wilderness. These were settler communities, towns, farms, people clearing land, people burning stumps, people who thought they had it under control. They didn't. But the fires weren't even the deadliest part of land clearing. That honor went to the trees themselves. The trees fought back. A new patch of land to clear. He'd been in the country exactly 4 weeks. His uncle, Robert Hamilton, was chopping a fallow, clearing land for planting. Robert went out to help one afternoon, but he had no experience felling timber. He didn't know how to read a tree's lean, didn't know how to judge which way the weight would carry it, didn't know how to cut the notch, so the tree fell where you wanted instead of where it wanted. He chose a large tree, set his axe, started chopping. The first large tree he tried to cut down fell in the opposite direction from what he intended. He saw it coming, started to run, ran the wrong direction toward the fall instead of away from it. The tree struck him. The trunk, hundreds of pounds, 60 feet of oak or elm, came down directly on top of him, killed him instantly. 4 weeks in Canada. A widow and 4 children left behind. No compensation, no safety net. Just a family, suddenly without a father, without an income, without anyone to clear the land they needed to survive. This wasn't rare. This was routine. In 2016, it had a fatal injury rate of 136 deaths per 100,000 workers, the highest in the country. And that's with modern safety equipment, steel-toed boots, hard hats, chainsaws with kill switches, OSHA regulations, trained professionals. Settlers had none of that. They weren't professionals. They were farmers trying to clear land. They didn't have safety equipment, didn't have training, didn't have backup. Just an axe, a team of oxen, and the desperate need to get crops in the ground before winter, or the mortgage came due, or the family ran out of food. And that was just the professional loggers working in camps. The forest didn't care that you had a family, didn't care that you needed the land, didn't care that you'd invested everything you had into this patch of soil. It had stood for 1,000 years. It had survived storms and fires and droughts, And it wasn't going down without taking a few of you with it. But here's the thing about settlers. They kept going anyway. Because the alternative was starvation. The alternative was going back east, tail between your legs, admitting defeat, losing the land you'd already bled for. So they buried their dead in small cemeteries on the edge of the property. They sharpened their axes, they said a prayer, and they went back into the forest the next morning, tree by tree, stump by stump, acre by acre, and slowly, agonizingly slowly, paid for in blood and broken bones and widows and orphans, they won. Every bridge remembers. By the 1870s, the transformation was complete, or nearly so. The South had gone from a region covered in continuous forest to a patchwork of fields and timber. 65 million acres cleared. The eastern seaboard, once solid green from the Atlantic to the Appalachians, now looked like a quilt. Patches of farmland surrounded by diminishing forest. Farmland stretched from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. Towns that hadn't existed 50 years earlier now had churches, schools, stores. Roads connected them. Rough roads, often impassable in spring, but roads nonetheless. The forest lost. But it didn't go quietly, and it didn't go for free. By the 1860s, Germany figured out how to mine potash from mineral deposits. The American ash trade collapsed. The American ash trade collapsed almost overnight. What had once paid for land clearing became worthless. The revenue stream dried up. Potasheries closed. The ash houses settlers had built to store their crop, literally their crop of ashes, sat empty. But the stumps? Those kept coming out. And then, in the 1920s, something new arrived that changed everything. The tractor. It was affordable and reliable enough for small farmers. By the end of World War I, tractor prices had dropped even further, down to $395 by 1922. Most farmers could justify the purchase, and once they did, the horses started disappearing. The numbers tell the story. In 1920, there were 25 million horses and mules on American farms. 25 million. About 3 or 4 animals for every farm. By 1945, just 25 years later, tractors had surpassed animal power entirely. The crossover point. More horsepower from machines than from horses. By 1960, only 4 million horses remained on farms, and most of those were for recreation, not work. The shift was dramatic, profound, complete. In 1915, 93 million acres of cropland, 27% of all harvested land in America, was used just to grow feed for horses and mules, oats, hay, corn for feed instead of sale. The land that once fed horses now grew cash crops. The forest that had taken lifetimes to conquer could now be leveled in a season. The machines won. But you can still see the cost if you know where to look. In some areas, particularly in older rural regions of the Northeast and Canada, stump fences remain. Massive roots and trunks, 6 feet thick, stacked like cordwood along property lines. Too heavy to move, too useful as boundary markers to destroy. They're monuments to the sheer scale of what was removed. Some of those fences are still standing today, more than 100 years later. Museums preserve the old stump pullers, rusted cable drums, wooden tripods weathered gray, Hercules machines with their gears frozen with age, axes with handles worn smooth by 10,000 swings, blasting caps and fuse cutters, and augers with 5-foot shanks. They sit behind glass now, relics of a war most people don't even know was fought. But the real monument isn't in a museum. It's the land itself. Every acre of farmland in the eastern United States was once forest. Every field, every pasture, every town square, every parking lot, every subdivision. Somebody cleared it. Somebody swung the axe 10,000 times. Somebody wrapped the chain around the stump. Somebody lit the fuse and ran. Somebody stood next to 30 yoke of oxen and shouted commands over the groaning of roots being torn from earth that had held them for centuries. Somebody buried a father, a brother, a son who didn't make it home from the logging bee, who was crushed when a tree fell wrong, who was hit when a chain snapped, who leaned over a hole to check a fuse that hadn't burned. The bridges we drive across every day were built with timber cut by men with hand-forged axes. The barns still standing in rural America, the ones that haven't collapsed yet, were raised at logging bees by communities that have long since dispersed. The soil that grows the wheat that makes your bread was once gripped by roots that settlers spent 15 years waiting to rot. We don't think about it. We drive past fields and see grass, corn, soybeans, pleasant pastoral scenes. But those fields are battlegrounds. The forest stood there for 10,000 years. Settlers took it down in 3 generations. 65 million acres. 250 years of continuous warfare against trees that didn't want to die, and stumps that didn't want to move. They won with axes and fire and oxen and dynamite and more courage than sense. They don't make them like that anymore. Not the machines. Those are all in museums now, or rusting in barns, or buried in fields that grew up around them. And not the men. Those are in cemeteries on the edges of the properties they cleared. Some with headstones, some without. All forgotten, except by the land they died to tame. But every bridge remembers, every field knows. And if you listen close enough on a quiet morning, when the mist is still rising from the ground, you can almost hear it. The ring of axes on wood, the crack of roots giving way, the sound of a forest losing a war it had already won for 10,000 years. The forest's revenge wasn't in the fires, or the falling trees, or the dynamite that went off too soon. It was in making them pay for every single acre.